Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning from Japan. This is the Tuesday, October 7, 2025 session in our series on innovations in artificial intelligence from Asia. I'm very happy that today we can address one of the major areas in which AI is probably going to go through a rather radical transformation. As you know, most of the processing for AI is done in data centers right now. But as we have more self-driving cars and intelligent robots and even, smartphones, there's going to be an increasing need for more efficient models of dividing up the processing between edge and local AI servers and then the data center. We have a company with us today that is right in the middle of this. I'm delighted that our speaker today, our main speaker, is Dr. Sakya Dasgupta, who is the founder and chief executive officer of EdgeCortix. And EdgeCortix is developing energy efficient edge processors for AI processors for both edge and dual use applications. Um, EdgeCortix is the first semiconductor company to be awarded a contract with the new United States Department of Innovation, Defense Innovation Unit. That's right, get it right. So Satya has held a variety of leadership roles, especially technology related, at Microsoft and IBM Research in Japan. He's also worked with national labs like Deakin in Japan and the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He's helped build technology divisions for startups in Japan and Singapore. He holds a PhD from the Max Planck Institute. He is a technologist turned entrepreneur with over 25 patents to his name and highly cited publications. And I'm also very happy that one of the investors in EdgeCortix is sending uh, a good friend, Mr. Shri Dodani, who is the founder and managing partner of Global Hands-On Venture Capital, which is a Tokyo and Silicon Valley-based venture capital firm that invests in Japanese startups and helps them go global. Shri is an old style VC in terms he's a serial entrepreneur and executive in various technology positions and operating companies. He was the CEO of Stratalight, which was acquired by Lumentum, and he was the CEO of VXTEL, which was acquired by Intel. He was a vice president of Carrier Access Corporation, which went public and then was acquired by Dell. He has BS in physics and mathematics and a master's in computer science and also a master's in business administration. So we have both the entrepreneur's perspective and also the investor's perspective in regard to how edge computing for artificial intelligence for edge computing will develop. Let me turn the microphone over to Sakya. I'll be here throughout the session this morning, but Shri is going to also act as our local co-host because he can see who wants to ask a question in the audience and I can't. So I will kind of get out of the way and let the substance of the session start. Thanks both of you for coming today.
Thanks, Richard, for that very kind introduction. So it's a pleasure to be here and talking about what we are doing as a company at EdgeCortix, but also more importantly, aligned with the theme, entrepreneurship in Asia's rapid growth high-tech industries. What I really intend to do today is I'm hoping that we can spend a lot more time in the active discussions. I think that should be a lot more interesting. I'll try to keep my presentation to be maybe around 25 to 30 minutes. I'm hoping to talk a little bit about who we are as a company, why Edge matters, and what does that mean. Richard really kind of set the tone as to how we are seeing a shift eventually from AI at the data centers towards devices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's important. Aligned with the theme, we as a company, we are based out in Japan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Japan, what's unique about Japan today, and what made us found our company there. And also uniquely the perspective of how AI is really driving today a rapid innovation around the overall semiconductor sector and how that's led to kind of a resurgence or reinvigoration or renaissance, however you want to call it, in terms of the semiconductor industry in Japan. So those are the broad themes that I want to touch upon. And then hopefully we can explore a lot more things in the active discussion. Okay, so before getting into the meat of things as to who we are, I wanted to really start off with why EdgeCortix exists as a company. Our core mission, with which really we founded the company now a little bit over 6 years ago, so we are fairly young, but the overall tailwinds of AI and broadly semiconductor industry has been driving us forward. The fundamental reason we exist is really a mission towards making AI, neural networks, machine learning, how you want to call it. I think AI is a little bit misused term with all of us who came from neural networks background before this AI world, is largely dominant by huge cost in terms of infrastructure, in terms of power, as well as the rapid scale at which we have been seeing explosive growth of AI models. That is kind of also driving the cost of silicon, both in terms of power as well as just the cost. That's really the reason we exist. How can we make AI a lot more sustainable? And secondly, is it possible for us to move compute towards the source of data creation? And that's what we call colloquially the edge computing, essentially any device, system, or a group of systems that is constrained by size, weight, power, and cost. We call the SWaP-C constraints in the industry. And that's what we are focused on. Can we make AI processing a lot more energy efficient? The key metric, so to speak, is performance per watt. That's what we are trying to kind of optimize for end customers, and as a byproduct, performance per dollar. And do that by building not just new silicon, but also a very effective and efficient software infrastructure. So it's really a combination of software and hardware that needs to be enabled to broadly cover the overall edge AI market. It's not silicon alone. To tell you a little bit about our journey as a company, as I said, we were founded in 2019. We are headquartered in Japan, so kind of uniquely non-Silicon Valley in that sense, but we do have presence in the US, both in the East and the West Coast, in India, where we have a development center, as well as in Singapore, kind of historically. So we are broadly spread across the overall Asia ecosystem, but again, global as a company. And we are also backed by several investors, including Global Hands-On VC, as well as few prominent other investors out of the overall ecosystem, whether that's in the US or Japan and some other parts of the world, including South Korea and Europe. And one of the things that kind of differentiates us in terms of our goals, other than the fact that we are really focused on making AI a lot more sustainable, is the fact that we are focused on the overall ecosystem as a fabless company. So as a fabless semiconductor company, our goal is, can we build that software and hardware solutions while still remaining fabless without the infrastructure costs that you require to do manufacturing at scale, but then bring those solutions just like the industry has been able to do that over the last many years, focusing on kind of a ground-up development or a first principles development of silicon, targeting much more energy-efficient AI processing. Before I go on and tell you a little bit more about how exactly we are doing that and the unique aspects of why Japan, as Richard mentioned, I should talk a little bit about my story, as well as a little bit of the story of why EdgeCortix exists. And I thought it would be quite bland to just put that in bullet points. What better way than talk about using Japanese manga, which was generated by AI. So here is kind of the story, okay? And I'll walk you through it very quickly. So I grew up in India, in a city called Calcutta in the 90s. And just like any other person, I would say at that time, being a very aspirational society, I was captivated by electronics. And I would say really three main passions that I had. One was computers. The other was trying to understand why the brain is so efficient. It's actually true that from a very early age, I was fascinated by the brain, and then space. I always thought that I would end up becoming an astronaut or an astrophysicist. Neither of them happened. but at least I'm working on electronics and trying to take inspiration from brain in some manner. And then years later, I ended up in Max Planck in Germany, where I pursued a PhD. At that time, this is still relatively early days compared to how we know deep learning today. So the focus was a lot more on brain-inspired computing. Essentially, the idea was, if you look at the brain, it's really a 10 to 20 watt device. That's the amount of power it really consumes. But you have all the seat of intelligence as we know it being generated by the brain. So the idea was simple. Can we build silicon? In the industry, we call it things like neuromorphics. So essentially, the idea is, can you make silicon or semiconductors, but it's inspired by the brain, a lot more energy efficient than what happens today in the large data centers. And then eventually I moved to Japan with RIKEN. It's a national research lab. You might know it from something called Fugaku. Until very recently, it used to be the fastest supercomputer in the world. I believe maybe around 2020, that's when it was on the top 500 list. So I had the privilege of working on Fugaku as well as on the compiler system that got applied for Fugaku. And then eventually to IBM Research, where the interest really turned towards taking algorithms or essentially machine learning models, deep neural network models that were designed for running on data centers, but then applying that on robotic systems, a classical edge solution where you have constraints, real world constraints of power, in many cases battery operated. And we discovered that you got to make some changes in those models, whether you're going to be compressing those models or you need to find a much more better hardware substrate itself compared to, let's say, a CPU or a GPU that was more well suited for running those models at more energy efficient manner. So lower power consumption without sacrificing accuracy for what they were developed for. And then eventually that led to us building EdgeCortix. And the most funniest thing here, I would say, I was not really surprised by GPT being able to generate these panels on its own, but the fact that it got my hairstyle and the timing of it right. I thought that was quite curious. So that's what we are doing as a company. The focus is really how to make AI sustainable. So let me kind of talk a little bit about why this is important and why now and why in Japan. So if you look at in the recent times, overall fabless ecosystem as well as semiconductor ecosystem has been driven by this kind of a revitalization, so to speak, by AI's exponential growth. So while AI is continuing to grow, that is really pushing the overall ecosystem in terms of building more efficient infrastructure that drives really AI. AI by itself, you cannot run these deep neural network models unless and until you have a very efficient ecosystem of hardware or infrastructure. And there is a concentrated effort towards that across the globe today, whether that's governments making some massive investments or at least announcements towards that, where they are launching multi-billion-dollar support plans across revitalization of manufacturing, R&D, fabless or design. Essentially, fabless or design really means the technology to build the semiconductor solution, the design it, and then of course you need the fabs and the foundries to really produce that. And there's a ton of investment going into that, especially if you focus on Asia on the right-hand side. I would say it's a north of $100 billion already collectively. Japan alone, initially they announced around $25 billion of government investments to domestically, essentially to reinvigorate the domestic semiconductor ecosystem. And then very recently, another $65 billion. All of them are very similar to the CHIPS Act, I would say, that you have in the US. And similarly, the European CHIPS Act, around 43 billion euros. So quite sizable investments are going into a concentrated sector of semiconductors. And that is great for an industry because it really enables us, especially deep tech startups, to be able to find some of those investments where you don't necessarily have to rely on very expensive equity capital. These are non-dilutive funding that the government is providing in order to drive deep tech R&D that typically is quite capital intensive in early days. So that's one of the key reasons why today we are seeing a lot of resurgence of AI-focused semiconductor companies, whether that's on the data center or on the edge. That also really dovetails into some of the key reasons why we as a company, we are in Japan. And I wanted to kind of highlight some of those aspects. So if you look at the overall Japan ecosystem, I would say Japan today is quite behind when it comes to pure AI, China and US. It's a fact. However, in the last 10 to 20 years, when Japan had diversified out of semiconductors, or at least the aspect of designing cutting-edge semiconductors, they have continued to build essentially the ecosystem of semiconductor equipment manufacturing, like companies like TEL. They are global leaders, top 5 in the world, similar to ASML and Applied Materials, for example. But the overall ecosystem of designing cutting-edge semiconductors and AI had died out. But that is changing now with all these concentrated efforts through these large investment programs with the government. Also, when we were starting in 2019, we saw that over the last 5 to 6 years, there has been a dramatic shift in terms of rise of the startup ecosystem. So today, if you think of the startup community across the world, probably we are in the Silicon Valley. That's the quintessential example of kind of the startup ecosystem. But then Japan has been catching up over the last few years. And I would say since from 2018 to 2023, the startup investment in Japan has grown by 25% CAGR year on year. So that's quite an impressive growth rate. I think still nowhere close to US, Israel, China, some of the other parts of the world, but it's still a very, I would say, it's an interesting drive that enables companies like us. The second is there is a strong, deep talent and R&D ecosystem that has always existed in Japan, whether that's in the universities or around cutting-edge research. And there has always been an influx of engineers moving from US to Japan as well. And now with this rising R&D as well as kind of startup ecosystem, we have found that a lot of the talent pool is staying in Japan. That has been another very welcome change, which has again enabled us to tap into world-class engineers, research, semiconductor expertise across companies like Sony, Fujitsu, a lot of the companies that you would typically think of in traditional semiconductors, but not in today's cutting-edge AI. Of course, we as a company, it helps us to be aligned with national priorities. You may have heard of things like sovereign AI. I mentioned that in the previous slide. The key idea is as AI continues to grow, there is a requirement today in a manner for every country to build their own sovereign AI infrastructure, which is resilient to changes that happen in global supply chains. So that is, again, with us focusing on fabless semiconductors and AI, especially on the edge side, which is driving power-efficient AI processing, it is aligned with the overall revival and emphasis of manufacturing and AI in Japan. And finally, a strategic support from governments. We ourselves, as I mentioned in the last slide, there's a huge amount of investment going into that ecosystem. We have had the privilege of being backed by Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. As of now, a little bit over $47 million in recent government support. These are non-dilutive funding, which for startups like us, during early days, it goes a long way, given that those are non-dilutive. So those are some fundamental reasons why we actually find a lot of benefit being in Japan. Changing gears a little bit and talking about the core subject, edge AI. So if we look at the overall market, of course, as a company, our key focus is how do we actually, focus on a market that is continuing to grow for a long period of time. AI across the market is, of course, probably trillions of dollars today. But if you carve out the total addressable market for AI hardware, it's probably north of $100 billion, depending on who you speak to. I think that's a pretty sizable market, largely driven by the fact there is a concentrated effort to a shifting left. In terms of the last multiple years, there has been a rise of data center. That's not going to slow down. It's going to continue to happen. But today, there is also a focus towards the inference sides, not just pure training. While training continues to happen in the data centers, when you're focusing on inference, that's really the real world deployment of those AI models. For that, you want to be able to move your compute as much as possible closer to the source of data. And as shown here, 75% of the world's data, enterprise data, is being generated at the edge. And that's really the market that we are focusing on, which would be a combination of enterprise edge and telecom edge. So your consumer edge is basically your mobile phones. the smartphone ecosystem, that is quite sizable. However, it's a relatively concentrated market. So we as a company, we focus on enterprise edge. Think of robotics, industrial automation, aerospace, dual-use technologies, smart city type of applications, all the way to AI and telecom combination. And that is quite a sizable market, probably around $30 billion of serviceable available market. If you break that down even further, and probably we'll talk a little bit more about this in the discussion section, there are 6 or 7 key verticals that are quite interesting for us as a company. You'll find that everything here is pretty kind of, you would commonly think about that when it comes to edge, with the exception of automotive not being shown here and healthcare. So there are pretty clear reasons why we as a company are not focusing on automotive and healthcare, and I'll leave that for the discussion section. But X of automotive and healthcare, the rest of the market is an open field, and it's really a long-tailed, fragmented market. And that's one of the key challenges when it comes to the edge. But in my opinion, that's also a very interesting area where it's not just about silicon or a new type of hardware, but software becomes a critical component of breaking through that long-tailed, fragmented market. So we are focusing on that area. What you see here at the bottom, these are some of the silicon that we produce. On the bottom left, that's a TSMC 12 nanometer product. You can think of this as a co-processor that you can augment an existing system with. Imagine a robotic system that is running on an ARM or an x86-based system. You augment it with essentially a small device where you can offload your AI processing. And if this device that you're adding to the system, if it does not require a lot of power, so in this example, it's around 8 watts or under, but gives you a considerable amount of computing power, 60 trillion operations. It's considerable amount of computing power that is available to you that enables you to run that solution for a long period of time, typically in a battery operated or an energy constrained environment. And that also leads me to essentially talking about what we are focusing on in terms of a technology. As I mentioned, while training continues to happen in your larger data centers, so from a training perspective, you're typically not constrained by power and size. You can do that in a large data center infrastructure. However, inference is essentially where you're taking those models that have been trained and then deploying them across real devices. In many cases, it could be a server or even the network edge. And there you have to work under the constraints of size, weight, power. So you need a scalable solution that can work across latest AI applications. For example, think of a model like Llama or a large language model, which is around 10, 20 billion parameters. If you want to run that on a robotic system, you need to be able to run that within those power constraints, as well as heat constraints that are dictated on a robotic system. You can't have the same luxury that you would have in a large data center to provide or throw at it all the computing power. What the inference applications are also differentiated by the speed at which you're processing or the time required to process. We call this latency. So you got to be more real time. Imagine, again, to take that robotics example, if the robot has to move around a real world environment, it is typically coming across constraints, objects, or people. It needs to make decisions quickly at real time. Again, you don't typically have those constraints in a typical data center applications. So these are the main constraints that we are working under when it comes to the edge. And then fundamentally, software is a very important aspect. And we can talk more about that in the discussion section. So we as a company, we focus on building what we like to call a zone of high efficiency. Effectively, the ability for us to design from first principles the hardware and also have a software ecosystem that enables you to not just work with one type of hardware, but enables you to work across different types of hardware platform across the edge ecosystem, embracing the fragmentation of the market, whether it's an x86 processor, an ARM-based processor, or a RISC-V processor. If you have to change your software every time, it becomes extremely challenging. So that's the whole kind of embracing the fragmentation idea. You have software that works with silicon across the overall heterogeneity of the edge AI market, where performance can be maximized without increasing power consumption. So your performance per watt is the fundamental metric you try to optimize. And without going into all the details, what we do as a company is that we kind of focus on that with an end-to-end kind of solution that goes from software all the way to the hardware. And that's a fundamental requirement if you're deploying any solution across the edge. On the left-hand side, our software stack is called Mirror. You think of this as the compiler, if you're familiar with compilers. So a compiler is essentially whatever tool that you use to translate from a software language to a language that the hardware or the piece of silicon understands in layman terms. So we focused on building a compiler that was not just designed for our hardware, our silicon, but enables you to talk across different types of hardware. Again, embracing the fragmentation of the market. So if you take a piece of silicon and augment, let's say, a system that is running on an x86, Intel, AMD, you need to be able to talk to that system as efficiently as going to an ARM platform. You don't have to change your compiler infrastructure every time. And that's what Mirror is kind of designed to do. And it's an important component of the overall edge solution. The second piece is, of course, the core brains. And that's where fabulous design comes in. Dynamic Neural Accelerator, think of this as the Neural Processing Unit, NPU. Is the core architecture that enables us to get a lot more energy efficiency from the piece of silicon that we are building, essentially getting a lot more work done without requiring a ton of power consumption. And that design gets embedded into the actual silicon. Sakura is basically cherry blossoms in Japanese. In our case, the reason we called it Sakura is essentially to showcase resurgence of new ideas in the space. That's a piece of silicon. The TSMC 12 nanometer product that I talked about previously, that's the core piece of semiconductor solution that inherently contains our DNA Dynamic Neural Accelerator NPU design, and then is also powered by the software, which is the Mirror compiler stack. So all in all, this is an example from our case, but in general, if you're deploying any solution across the edge market, it needs to have the combination of software as well as hardware. Pure silicon or pure software only goes to a limited extent. Finally, I'll summarize by just showcasing one example, which I like to call a frontier example. While we are bringing solutions across the market from robotics, aerospace, smart city, space is really the final frontier, so to speak, when it comes to the edge. Think about a satellite that is being deployed in space. You don't really have the luxury of bringing that satellite down to change its hardware. We have deployed it, it's got to last for a long period of time. Or think about a rover on Mars or even Moon. For example, we are working with companies like iSpace to deploy a solution on the surface of Moon. On Moon, unlike the Earth, you have very long, different periods of night and day, 14-day cycles of night, 14-day cycles of daylight under very extreme conditions. So in those conditions, you have this extreme edge scenario where you've got to conserve your power for a long period of time without sacrificing the overall AI compute. And that's an area that we are focusing on. And as Richard mentioned, we are partnering with the Defense Innovation Unit. It's a Pentagon unit in the US, part of the US DoD, which is essentially focused on bringing dual-use technologies, which are commercially relevant hardware and software, but that can be applied in environments like space for really running latest AI applications. Let me stop there. And I think hopefully I've been able to give you a little bit of an overview across the broader edge AI landscape, why Japan, why semiconductors, and hoping to explore a lot more in the active discussions and talk a little bit about even the investment side with Shri. Thank you.
GHOVC, Global Hands-On VC, is its early stage VC focus, mostly focused on investing in Japanese startup. And just like why Japan for him, same thing people ask us, why Japan? You're sitting in Silicon Valley. For us, it was an opportunity very similar to in 2005 when we started a fund in India. Nobody wanted to invest in India, even $5 million. And after 2009, Flipkart happened and changed the history. They have 100 plus unicorn. Japan is the same thing. If you ask any US investor, it's a not in my backyard kind of thing, and we don't invest in Japan. It's not motivation and good entrepreneurs and so forth. We see as an opportunity, just like a startup would see for disruption, we see that in Japan. I also talked about other companies. on that one. It's established by a Japanese and American cross-border team. All of us have been entrepreneurs multiple times, and as well as one of our partners been venture partner for at least 25 years across 3 different funds. And so we bring a lot of hands-on experience to the team. And luckily, in case of Sakya, he doesn't need our help. He's good on his own, but at least we are there if he ever needs our help. We are anchored by large Japanese corporation and institution like insurance company, like any other VC fund. The team background is tech startups. One of our co-founder was early founder of Oracle Japan. He took public locally in Japan. And then subsequently, he's brought a lot of Japanese, American companies to Japan. And this is an attempt for bringing Japanese company on a global basis, including Salesforce, Japan, Marketo, Concur, mostly SaaS play in that. Our combined track record is fantastic. We're proud of it. We've invested over 150 companies among 5+, and we returned 86% IRR across 20 years of that history. Quickly, I'm going to give why Japan. EdgeCortix is one of our first investment out of the fund in Japan. The whole idea was he convinced me over the dinner that he's actually building a software that's going to coexist with NVIDIA, Intel, and Xilinx, and he makes them all perform better than they would without his software. So that's pretty good because that's what made Apple switch from Intel to ARM processor when the company came up with the middle layer software. This would be cool that people can use his software across all 3 and provide a heterogeneous network. And so that's got me interested. But over time, he said, not only that, I can actually improve the power envelope as well as cost envelope if I did this DNA. Okay, it got me more interested. Eventually, he built a chip, a co-processor accelerator, which is 10x better power than the current solution. And he's built an awesome team around him, a global team. It's just like a Silicon Valley sitting in Japan. Some of our other companies are also why Japan. If you look at Integral AI, they're presented here before in the past, but they're building an AGI model. And in terms of, if you look at the traditional large language model or visual language model, they're actually massive power consumption and compute consumption. These guys have built true AGI, which can reason and rebuild and learn, self-learn, to build the next generation robot on its own for less than $5 million. We don't make the announcement like DeepSeek, but that's a company, the ex-Google guys, pedigree is US because they both work for DeepMind and Google and Stanford grad, but they happen to be sitting in Japan. That's another example of why innovation out of Asia is happening. It's not just in the US. Braid is another fantastic company. A couple of guys out of Cambridge and Italian Polytechnic, PhD professors, they moved to Japan to build a robotics company, and then eventually this company. What this company does, the next generation of Autodesk. It self-designs your physical world. Everything you see around the world has been designed by engineer. This thing is starting to automate the whole thing. And it's got a large compute model, a materials model, geometry, and compute algorithm where you can do literally 10,000 alternative design in hours compared to an engineer who's given a task to design the next generation door for the automotive. It may take 6 months to 1 year to figure out 5 different models. This thing can do 10,000 different designs simultaneously. Is this what we call it AI for the physical world, not just for text and images and video, but these are some of the examples of innovation that's happening in Japan. And that's the theme of it. So that's a quick announcement of why we invest, who we invest with. And every one of them is a smart bunch of 15, 16 PhDs trying to build cool stuff.
Shri, can I ask the first question?
Sure.
So, Sakya, you mentioned that you're not investing in automotive and healthcare right now. Here's your chance. Would you follow up and explain why not? Those are big verticals.
Yeah, as a startup, so when I said we are not investing, but rather I would say we are not focusing particularly on automotive and healthcare ourselves. But
okay.
Immediately, if you look at automotive, it's a typical market where you need a long cycle of certifications, safety criticality. Typically, you have to go through a long drawn process on the software as well as the hardware side. while you also have a concentration of only few players in the world in terms of actual customers that you could work with. So that's an area where, as a startup company, I think fundamentally you got to choose your bets very carefully and focus on markets where you can grow your revenue relatively quickly rather than taking a long period of time. So that's one reason why we are not focused on automotive immediately, just to avoid that long cycles. I think it's a market where typically autonomous cars, for example, has been long-term coming, and of course there are some very good examples of it working in practice, but it really hasn't reached the scale. I myself have actually worked in this space. So it's a tough area where I think it will require you to have very targeted vertical focus, probably a dedicated company by itself. So that's number one. On healthcare, I think it's similar cases. So while when I said we don't focus on healthcare, I think we don't directly focus on healthcare. I think it's very, very challenging and very noble, of course, to build solutions that impact people's lives. And I think we are trying to do that with sustainable AI tech. But healthcare, similar to automotive, is again very certification driven. And that's something that we are trying to avoid ourselves. Having said that, I mean, the edge market, we work with companies that build solutions like better imaging platforms. An imaging solution that can be used in healthcare sector, it's really an edge device. You think about a small handheld device that may enable better diagnosis. In that case, you can have a compute platform like ours combined with software to enable running in that constrained environment. So that's something that we do, but pure healthcare is not something that we're focused on.
But you also have a customer with building a humanoid for healthcare purposes, right? Meaning like elderly care or in the hospital, multimodal interfaces.
Yeah, that's a good example, right? So that's where I meant that while we are not directly focused on healthcare, there are a lot of applications that can be deployed in healthcare solutions. So the one that, Shri, you're mentioning, that's really a robotics application. So today, for example, we are seeing this, again, resurgence, so to speak. I've worked in robotics also, interestingly, myself. And robotics is an area where I think, again, it's long-term coming. There was a promise that we would have robots in our houses, all of us. It still really hasn't happened other than the Roomba, so to speak. But what we are working on now is really this quasi-humanoid robot. It's a wheel robot with a human torso. But most importantly, it can interact in natural language. It can use models like Whisper to do text-to-speech, speech-to-text in real time, and then use essentially combination of a large language model with a knowledge base where it can run through all the patient data that is all available on the robotics platform. And then the natural language interaction on a large language model enables humans to talk to that platform very easily. And of course, it has all the natural sensors like cameras and LiDAR to be able to navigate environment like a hospital. So that's an example where it's a humanoid robot being deployed in a hospital care facility, especially in Japan. And it's a very aging society, so you do need solutions like that.
So Shri, if you don't mind me asking one more question to Sakya, and then I have a question for you, and then I'll kind of let you moderate questions from the floor in the auditorium for a bit. My follow-up to Sakya, it's not really an AI question as much as it is a semiconductor question. What kind of things do you have to do to qualify the chip for use in outer space?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So fundamentally, if you think about spaces, it's a very tough environment. So typically, one of the things that is critically important is the ability for it to have resiliency around radiation. So in the space, you have very high radiation levels compared to what you would have terrestrially on Earth. So any piece of silicon needs to be able to operate under those conditions. And as you go more deeper into space, so for example, if you're closer to the Earth's surface with a GEO or a LEO environment, so that's low Earth orbit or geosynchronous orbit, which are typical satellites, you have much less radiation. As you go further out towards the moon, the radiation increases. And if you go deeper, let's say Mars, in that case, the radiation impact would be a lot higher. So you got to have silicon that works under those environments. You also need extreme temperatures. So for example, as I said, on the surface of the moon, temperatures can go from minus 150 to plus 150. So you have a very wide range of temperatures that you need to be able to cover with your semiconductor solutions. Interestingly, we as a company, we never really thought our silicon would be used in space. It was not a target area for us, to be absolutely honest. What we focused on was building essentially semiconductor solution with relatively strong resiliency, especially for aerospace applications, let's say 100, minus 40 to 125. That's terrestrially relevant temperatures on Earth that you need for aerospace applications. But lo and behold, I think looking at things that has happened in space area with companies like SpaceX, the cost of bringing solutions to space is being reduced dramatically. So in our case, NASA actually reached out to us saying that there was a targeted program to take commercially off-the-shelf devices, what we call COTS solutions, and see whether they can be operated in the space environment. The reason you want to do is, in that case, you don't need to reinvent the entire software ecosystem. A COTS device that we are today providing, let's say commercially, or to a robotics application, that's running the same open source software stack, let's say a PyTorch model or a TensorFlow Lite model. You want to be able to take that and still run that in space. You don't want to change that ecosystem. And also, building specialized packaging or specialized silicon for space is very expensive. You also want to be able to avoid that. So in our case, we have been, I think it's been quite a serendipitous discovery ourselves that a lot of the tools and IP that we were creating with redundancies in mind enables us to withstand radiation in space by a significant margin. As a result, the COTS solution that we have can operate in space without requiring specialized packaging. So that means the cost as a business is a lot lower, but we have relevance of that application in the space environment.
Thanks. So Shri, my question to you is to tell us a little bit about the thought process that went through your mind in deciding to invest in EdgeCortix. Because, you know, as Sakya showed, there's a wonderful opportunity here. It's a major trend in the early stages. But what are the kind of things that attracted you to EdgeCortix?
Thank you, Richard. I think first and foremost, we look for a team and the market opportunity followed. So team, obviously, as you can see, he's impressive. He's talked to a lot of guys, and he's got a team around him also, very, very bright guys who have built software. That was what attracted me first time around. But this software was, you could put Xilinx, Altera, Intel, AMD, and NVIDIA in a heterogeneous environment, and you make them work without changing a single line of code application there. Pretty impressive. And in the past, a lot of those companies have been fantastic in terms of exit value. So that's got me interested in that. The second was the low power. As you know, a lot of the data center guys and training guys are almost buying power companies, let alone the computer. And his power consumption was 10x better for the same performance. At the same time, without requiring somebody to change software. So that's attracted me, and his ability to execute. It's very rare in a silicon business with people who've been in the silicon business to get your tape out, the first tape out successful. Not just for one chip, but multiple chip. And that's very, very costly. If he has to tape out another chip second time, it's a $7 million out of pocket for venture guys. So he's been able to show that he's done both chips on the first time. The third chip he's going to tape out again. So these are the attractive part for us as an investor. And lastly, in terms of the US, Japan, China, there were over-investment in the US and over-investment in China from a funding point of view in AI. A lot of money went in there. Average, there were about 15, 16 companies in the US, raised almost $500 million, $600 million, and not much to show for even Julia did because the LLM came about. All of those companies started before on the CNN model. So when large language model came, none of these could perform the task. In his case, luckily, he had started right after that, or about the time he had done the software and he started the chip at the LLM time. So competitively, with a massive advantage over US and certainly China. I don't know all about China, but they also over-invested money. Japan was the only place, the only silicon company that was trying to do AI, and with the Japanese government behind it.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, you're very kind, of course. But I'm just looking at the theme of today's session, right? So it's unique to think about. I think there's a high bias towards action that you got to have. And I think we had that high bias towards action to get things done. But the fact is, when we were starting EdgeCortix in 2019, at least to me, everybody said, don't build a company in Japan. That was the first thing everybody said. Because you want to do AI processing, you want to do semiconductors, that's probably not the right place. So again, because we had this high bias towards action just to get it done, it was kind of a bet that we were making that there's going to be a resurgence of semiconductors. We really did not know about that. But also, fundamentally, in general, if you're building a company anywhere in the world, I think it's better to be in a market where you have, your overall demand vastly outstrips supply. It's a good ingredient to start a company. And Japan, as Shri mentioned, and I think it's broadly reflective of Asia in general today, there's a huge influx of course, talent. As I said, China is ahead of overall, maybe Japan, and I think definitely Japan in terms of AI, and maybe to a certain extent US as well when it comes to overall AI capacity of, if you use the number of papers that are being published in conferences like ICLR or NeurIPS, that's probably indicative of the amount of technologies coming out of there. But in general, the overall appetite for building an ecosystem is very high, especially Japan, which diversified out of semiconductors and in a manner AI in the last 15 years, today is clearly realized that it's got to build its own sovereign capabilities and then working alongside partners like the US. And I think that's been a very strong tailwind for us as a company.
And when we invested, we didn't know all of this either.
Shri, why don't I ask you to look for questions from the audience?
Can I ask one question before I go? Because one of the investor questions I always get asked.
Sure.
When I talk to US investors, one of the things they talk about, I tell them we're proud about the power, and we're 10x power better, lower cost, and so forth. And many of them will tell me, well, look at it this way, China has enormous power. They don't care about power. They can buy at 100 rather than 300 or 200. And then you look at human consumption of energy, like calories, for the first 25 years of human, they say it's only 2 million calories. So if you take a ChatGPT-4, it costs about 105 megawatt hours, which burns about family of four for 120 years. It's still, relatively speaking, small compared to human energy. And then they throw in the argument that in case of human, we're learning, each one of it's learning separately at 2 million calories for 25 years, which is a computer is to burning 125 megawatt for the whole population of 7 billion people. Is highly efficient. So why do you think the world will accept you as a low energy solution? I think you gave a lot of example earlier, but the reality is from an investor point of view, media continues to say, power doesn't matter, compute matters, keep buying from you. And why here you come with a low power solution?
I think everybody kind of realizes that you got to make AI a lot more sustainable. I think it's a clear realization. At least if you look at all conversations today, I think nobody is really saying that you're going to just keep driving the cost of power to be greater. I think in our case, why this becomes even more important is that whole edge concept. If you are in a data center, which is a lot more homogeneous, today, companies are talking about co-locating the data center close to a nuclear power plant. And then, it's funny, but it's a requirement because the amount of energy that you need to run that overall infrastructure, and it's going to continue to rise because foundational models are continuing to grow. And then today we're talking about AI agents, which is continuing to kind of consume a lot more about that computing resource. But if you want to now deploy that solution in the real world, so when I say real world, in actual devices, whether that's a robotic system or it's an extreme example like a satellite in space, or for example, it's let's say a small device that enables you to communicate with it, let's say a teller system or smarter ATMs, so to speak. These run with constraints of electricity, size, weight, and under those constraints, you don't have the same luxury. So there, energy efficiency is not a good to have, it's a must have. You need to be able to run under those constraints if you don't want to sacrifice the accuracy of the model that you're running. Typically, you don't want to be able to, what we hear from our customers today, going back to that example of a robot deployed in a hospital environment, the model that they are trying to run if possible, they want to run a 100 billion parameter model on that robot. Today, we just can't because you need a lot more compute as well as power. So our focus is, today we are deploying a 10 billion parameter model on that robot. Can we make that hardware and software efficient enough that we can run that 100 billion parameter model, which is going to be a lot more accurate on that same robot without the robot being extremely slow to respond? So it's still continuing to be real time. So that's kind of key reason, I would say, to make it a lot more efficient.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think there was a question.
Open it up here.
So I kind of have like a two-part question. So first, do you think that right now there's more demand for increasing AI or increasing data centers to accommodate that increase in AI?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's like a catch-22 question, right? So you need the compute infrastructure to essentially run your AI solutions. And I think, again, everybody recognizes that. So just to go back, when I started my career, I have worked in neural networks all my life, but deep neural network, as we know it today, did not exist. Now, until 2010, prior to AlexNet, it was not there. And one of the key reasons of manner why AlexNet was successful is because we threw a lot of computing power towards it. And I think that's kind of what is driving today. So AI will continue to grow, but in order for AI to continue to grow, you also need the infrastructure to be sustainable and supporting it. There's a very interesting paper by somebody called Sarah Hooker from Google. It's called the Hardware Lottery. I highly recommend that, where she argues that at any given point in time, the success of an algorithm is essentially a hardware lottery. So which model or AI algorithm succeeds depends on what was the hardware or efficient hardware available at that time. So today, in a manner, the models that we are running, transformers, so to speak, maybe they are a byproduct of the GPU hardware that they ran on. So that's also something that we are very cognizant of. So can we build that hardware and the software co-design in a manner such that we are ready for the next evolution, the next lottery that is going to enable us to get a lot more efficient algorithms as well.
Good. Thank you for the great talk. How do you protect the IP in a fabless business model?
Yeah, great question. So I think the classical example is somebody like ARM. So if you think of, okay, let me just take a step back. So fabless, there are two types of fabless. One is a fabless design company like ARM, for example, who are in the business of designing the IP and then just licensing that out to the world. You also have fabless like NVIDIA, Qualcomm, or EdgeCortix. We are fabless product companies where we design it and then sell the end product to the customer. We typically don't license the IP. The classical way is, one is, of course, you have patents to be able to kind of secure the IP that you have. You have licensing models that enables customers to essentially use that license. But most importantly, in the overall ecosystem, we've got to be able to build a very strong moat around either software or essentially a vast network of distributing that IP across different types of platforms. That ARM did very well with, for example, the whole risk, compared to the previous generation of IPs that has been a lot more prominent with x86, and that has worked very well with smartphones, mobile, essentially ecosystem where you need those constraints of power and of energy. I think so. Those are the mechanisms. So you got to build a strong moat. You use software to essentially increase the switching cost, and that enables you to kind of create a protection around what you're building or enabling or bring that to your different partners and customers. There's no really a simple solution there. In a manner, I would say open source is also a good mechanism to protect. It's counterintuitive, but if you have an open source ecosystem around software, that can be that enables you to have many users. That is also a very good way to protect your IP. Classical example is, let's say, communities like Raspberry Pi that have created a very strong ecosystem with available for hobbyists, and today we are seeing that is being used even in actual developments.
Richard, I'm going to take one more question and then you can go on the thing. But
Okay.
Yeah. I'm wondering, how are you thinking of like the competition of the existing incumbent on the edge chips? Because like, for example, I know you're not in the kind of threading space, but there's for and Orion from NVIDIA. For like PC, there's like Apple, and then there's all the smartphone companies making their own chips, Huawei, etc. And on like all the other edges, there are existing incumbents. So I guess like what exactly is the differentiator or like the niche that you're trying to tackle?
Yeah, great question. So it's not always necessary that you got to have a niche. Let's just recognize that first. But fundamentally, I think all of these efforts are driven by the fact that you got to have specialization around that specific domain, which in this case is AI, rather than purely building a general purpose hardware like a CPU or a GPU. One may argue is also quite general purpose. Building hardware that is a lot more tailor fit towards the idiosyncrasies of an AI model or the way a neural network works, is basically a graphical structure, will enable you to have a lot better power as well as energy efficiency. And I think that's the reason why you're seeing, whether that's an NPU in a laptop or it's, let's say, an SoC platform with the one that you give an example of. The way we see it, the way we are entering this market is through this augmentation model. So there's a very high switching cost for a customer if they would have to take their existing SoC, let's say an existing system on a robot that is already operating. It could be an ARM platform, could be an x86 platform. If the customer has to take that and completely replace that with something else, it's a very high cost because software typically needs to follow together with it. So our approach has been to essentially use a co-processor method. So can you augment an existing system by just connecting through an existing I/O interface? Typically, we call it a PCIe M.2, very easy to access interface that gives the ability of that robotics platform or an edge platform to have run a much more larger model that they could not run previously, and then do it without requiring a ton of power. That's a much more easier method to essentially penetrate the market where the switching cost for the customer is not very high. Thereafter, I think you've got to be able to still continue to innovate on the hardware side. So we are doing that. So we see overall Moore's law slowing down dramatically. It is a fact. I would not call it dead, but clearly it's not growing at the historical rate that it was growing previously. So we are embracing something called chiplets. Essentially, the idea is make Lego-like building blocks that enables a lot more disaggregation of your semiconductor solution. Rather than create a single piece of chip, which is an SoC, typically to design a chip takes anywhere between 18 months to 2 years to complete that process, and then maybe another year in the fastest case, so almost 3 years to go from design to an actual production deployment. With chiplets, you can shorten that process where you can build Lego-like building blocks that enable you to combine solutions. So I think those are a few things that we'll see in the market moving forward. I don't think there is one solution that works across the whole fragmented edge market. NPUs on the laptops or smartphones will continue to coexist with more efficient solutions that are required for scalable platforms like a humanoid.
Actually, just follow up on that. Actually, I completely agree with you that edge computing will be like the future. I think there needs to be high efficiency and energy efficient edge chips at the end of the day. I'm wondering, like, because everything go edge, computation actually requires the usage of quite like a variety of different models. And when you're thinking of like building the infrastructure or like chip designing from that point of view for a dynamic multi-model system, what is the critical thought process that goes into your software design and then hardware integration?
Fantastic question. I could not have said better. So in fact, that's the first thing that one needs to solve. So in fact, when we started as a company, rather than building the silicon first or having a hardware first mindset, we had a software first mindset. So if you look at the overall ecosystem, software is the elephant in the room. It's not really the hardware. What does software first mean? You've got to be able to build a software framework, compiler, however you call it, that not only works for your hardware, but enables easy integration of that hardware across the broader ecosystem at the system level. In the industry, we call it a heterogeneous compiler. That's what we did. So when I was showing you this example of Mera, unlike, let's say, a CUDA platform or somebody else's compiler, which is designed for one type of hardware, Mera was designed to work alongside CUDA or work alongside LLVM, which is a compiler for ARM, for example, or across the overall x86. That means when we provide that hardware, which can be easily integrated using the existing IO on your system, the customer does not need to go and rethink what should be the software infrastructure that I build for it to talk easily to that piece of hardware. So that's the first piece. You got to get the software right, and it's a continuous process. It needs to be able to work across the gamut of machine learning frameworks. So for example, when we started, we focused on PyTorch, TensorFlow, and ONNX as the major frameworks, looking at the wider adaptation, and then build API layers, which are very easily, can be easily accessed by the existing hardware platform. On top of that, you got to be able to leverage open source communities or solutions like Hugging Face, for example. So we do that. There's a ton of models that are available on Hugging Face. The reason you need to do that is many of these models were designed to work on a GPU. For example, let's say from a data center perspective. So when the customer wants to deploy that solution, if you have an easy API that can bring an existing model on Hugging Face to your hardware solution without the customer having to change the model, retrain it, or require some other specialized operator, you've already won quite a bit of that battle. So yeah, great question. Software is really, I would say, 70% of the work. And as Shri was mentioning, that was the key message that I had pitched him in the beginning, that software has to be the key thing that you build, and then you build hardware from there, not the other way around.
Thank you. And that's the reason. Should you have a question online? Maybe there are a lot of questions. Yeah, I can keep going.
Yeah, actually, I do have one, and I'm going to violate our protocols. Our colleague, John Metzler, who teaches in the Haas School of Business over at UC Berkeley, is online with us right now. I'm going to ask John to give his question verbally, and I understand you're getting accompanied by the Cal Band.
All right, thank you, Richard, and great to see Sakya again. And first, thank you for letting me ask directly. You may hear the bass drum behind me, so advance apologies if you do. I guess this is a market prioritization question. Sakya, you'd observed that the automotive market has been a tough one for startups, and I agree with that. Some of the other ones you had highlighted, AI RAN, for example, or industrial robotics, also are fairly concentrated and also have relatively long evaluation cycles in the evaluation period. So I was very curious as to, like, of those, where are you seeing the most traction of, are any of those being a little bit more responsive than, say, automotive to what you're offering? Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question in general because as we just mentioned, building a solution targeting the edge market, you got to embrace fragmentation. So pure vertical focus is going to be very tough to do when it comes to overall edge market. If I had to choose one market where I see that growing the fastest and also kind of relevant from our own business perspective, I would say robotics. Given that robotics solution is an area where the compute platform can be a common solution across different types of robot. So today we are working with one of the top 10 robotics companies in the world, where the same company is building a humanoid robot. You're also building industrial robots, and they have surgical robots. Again, healthcare example. Now, if you have a compute solution that can scale across all of this robotics platform, that's actually a volume example. It's very good for businesses like us. You can have stickiness, and you can replicate that same solution across many types of robots. You don't need to tailor fit that solution or have a vertical integration across a specific type of robot. The second area, I would say, I didn't talk a lot about this, but servers in general, edge is it's a continuum. So when we talk about edge, many people think about sensors. That's the lower end of the edge. But imagine this building, the auditorium, the Bishop's Auditorium. In my opinion, that's an edge infrastructure. If you have a few number of servers that are locally managing all the compute processing in this auditorium, that's a smart building example, which is essentially an edge solution. It's more of a network edge, a larger edge than a data center. And we are seeing traction there as well. So in those cases, imagine a small server, maybe a rack of processing, if you're able to bring down that overall power consumption of the rack by 10 times, but still able to run the models like 20 billion parameter large language model on that server ecosystem, on that the server infrastructure, that's an area where there is a lot of good opportunities.
Follow on that one, John, if I may, but it's like one of the things, like a lot of people are now starting building data centers in space, which is a constrained energy environment, right? Do you see the big opportunity there, especially given your radiation hardened?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that. I didn't mention that given John's argument that near term, I think there are clearly many of the applications we are working on is geared towards what we call orbital data centers. And I think there is a drive, so to speak, to move compute now from terrestrially to the space. And that's not really going to be relevant for terrestrial applications in the near term, but it's going to be relevant a lot for the space infrastructure. So when you have satellites, as well as, let's say, space missions happening, there's a huge amount of cost if you have to move data. The bandwidth required to communicate from Earth to anything in space is very expensive. So the key idea is if we can have orbital data center that provides a compute infrastructure for everything that happens in space, maybe on the moon, maybe close to the Earth, a constellation of satellites, that's going to be a lot more energy efficient. So of course, we are part of that. The Defense Innovation Unit piece that we mentioned, we are part of a project in the US called Hybrid Space Architecture. It's very interesting, where there's an effort to essentially create a unified computing platform that combines both AI processing as well as communications across sea, land, air, and eventually space, so that you have optimized compute across all of those, where you don't have to switch between the different types of computing infrastructure. It's a multi-year journey, but it's critical for national security in many places, definitely the US.
And it pays well.
Let me do one more before you go in, because this is a direct follow-up to what you were saying. Rajarsh has asked about AI processing in space. And in space, one of the issues is what's called a single event effect, where one particle somehow gets through the radiation hard packaging and, affects the hardware system. So if you're in the middle of deep neural network, layers and layers of neural net processing, how do you handle that for AI being processed in space?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question as well. So, one of the unique things that we discovered ourselves is, so working with NASA, we actually did radiation tests, initially very close by at the Lawrence Berkeley lab, and then very recently at the Texas A&M as well, where you're essentially bombarding heavy ions onto our piece of silicon, trying to replicate what happens in space. Now, every time heavy ions, radiation impacts silicon, it essentially causes something called bit flips. A bit flips, that means a 0 becomes 1 or a 1 becomes 0, which it should not be. In case of neural networks, all the knowledge is in the weights. So imagine if you're storing those weights, the parameters, and the bit flips, a cat is now going to be recognized as a dog. Major issue. Maybe not in space, but could be some other object. It turns out that if you now design your IP, the core NPU that you're putting into your piece of silicon with redundancies in mind, that means if you now have multiple pathways to go from point A to point B, rather than go from A to B, if I can go from A to B in various different ways, even if one of those pathways become corrupt, there are other pathways that are available to you. The second is, if we can maintain or have smarter ways in the software to maintain copies, redundancies of the weights, the parameters, maybe in a compressed manner, and be able to recover that when bit flips happen, that enables you to have self-resiliency under these kind of, or essentially prevent single event failures where you have a complete destruction. So in our case, it was very interesting that some of those redundancies that we build into our IP, as well as the software, showcase that when these tests were done by the NASA NEP program, not a single event failure happened. That means there was not a single destructive event. That's really massive. Think about a hardware that is being deployed in space. that means it can now operate for a very long period of time in a LEO environment for 12 months without requiring any kind of system reboot, as well as not having a single event failure. A single event failure means that hardware is probably not going to work for you anymore. So if you have a satellite, you would have lost that satellite, or at least that part of the processing of the satellite. So yeah, I mean, so that really goes towards the IP design. I can talk at length about this, but yeah, it's a very interesting aspect where building redundancies, just like that we do for automotive, actually can have a huge impact even for resiliency in space.
Thanks. Shri, the floor is over to you.
I mean, we have a memory company that's the same reason. They're growing very, very fast because of space radiation hardness, the magnetic memory as well. Questions? Well, I'm going to go switch over, please.
Hi. So you mentioned that under the same budget, your hardware, your AI accelerator, the turn time versus other industry competitors. So what are the competitive products you are testing? And second, what KPI you're using, like applications, use cases you're running to measure the power?
Yeah, great question. So fundamentally, if I may, yeah. So it depends really on what the application is. So if it comes to, for example, video processing or any kind of application that requires images or videos, typically it's frames per second, inferences per second per watt. That's kind of the typical measure. That means how fast I can process that piece of data, let's say to recognize a piece of object. So latency and frames per second per watt are the typical units. In case of language models, I think now the metric is tokens per second per watt. So tokens per second is really a metric of how fast tokens can be generated. The faster you can generate, the faster response time you have. There are other measures like the time to first token. So when you're, if you've used GPT, for example, the time it takes GPT to give you the first response can be quite important. If you're in an application like translation, your response time is more important than how much the volume of data that you can pass through. So we typically look at that, and then what is the power required to generate that tokens per second? That's the typical KPI or the metric.
But there is any industry standard test, for example, frame per second for video. Is that any standard video clip we run instead of you handpick a few? Also for token, what the prompt, right, you're generating, is there any standard you're using? Because specific standard questions to all the, if it's a language text-based, right? Yeah, this is right. You say frame per second, the token,
Yeah, I mean,
it's a standard.
interesting question. So I think the question is, if I may repeat that for the rest of the audience as well. So the question is there a standardized kind of benchmark, right? Unfortunately, there is no standardized benchmark. And I think it's a big challenge today in the industry. In the data center, at least there are some concentrated effort around purely measuring throughput, whether that's tokens per second, and you measure that across a gamut of algorithms. That essentially gives you, in a manner, an average or holistic picture across what would be the performance that you would get vis-a-vis the power that you require for it. On the edge, because it's a fragmented market, and an application on a robotic system could be very different from an application across, let's say, a smart city, where you have many cameras working together. Unfortunately, there is no standardized benchmark today. So what really happens is we tend to work with, of course, our benchmarks that are available. And then you typically have to work with the customer to essentially see whether that's fulfilling the customer's requirement. Where typically you would take the application that the customer wants to run, whether that's a robotics application or a space application or a smart city application, and see what is the actual performance you're getting on our hardware platform and software platform vis-a-vis what was available previously.
Cool. So you mean you already have a customer, paying customer?
So I think we're going to have to limit one more question to the audience.
Richard, I see a question for a long time.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the insightful presentation. You mentioned about 10 billion parameter models being trained using GPU, and then you have to quantize from floating point, 16 to int 8, which dramatically reduces the accuracy of the models. And that's what you have to do today. Looking ahead, what are your thoughts on, closing the gap in the disparity between GPU and NPU, which needs to, run at very, low power? And then I have another question. Why did you choose 12 nanometer? Because a lot of your, edge AI inference competitors are using 5, 3, and 2 nanometer.
Yeah, great question. So on the first question, I would actually differ. It is not today where we are, it's no longer required to actually do quantization. When we started, our first generation silicon was actually optimized for integer 8-bit. For the audience, if you're not familiar with it, your typical processing that you're doing in floating point, large number of precision. So let's say 32-bit or 16-bit. So you have 2 to the power of that many bits available to you. So more precision, the more accuracy. We did focus on integer 8-bit. However, today it is actually possible to have hardware. So our current generation hardware does something called mixed precision, where you can now let the software decide automatically which part of the model remains in floating point 16-bit and which part of the model should get quantized to integer 8-bit. And the metrics that you use could be, for example, signal to noise ratio, accuracy metrics, as well as metrics that are relevant in terms of performance to decide how you trade off that accuracy versus performance gap or power, for example. So it's not absolutely necessary, and there are techniques that exist. One mechanism is to bring your memory and your compute closer together rather than separate that out. And if you're able to process a lot more closer to memory, there are a lot of techniques that we can use from a design perspective of the NPU, where we can run many of the models at a higher precision. You don't have to go to lower precision all the time. Your second part of the question, I've actually forgotten now.
The cost
Why 12 nanometer?
12 nanometer.
12 nanometer versus,
Yeah, so it's an interesting piece, right? So if you can get to a 10x performance per watt gap compared to a 7 nanometer or a 5 nanometer product with a 12 nanometer product, and you're better off building it for 12 nanometers. So that's really the metric. Performance per dollar is what drives, or at least drove us to select 12 nanometer as our first and second generation solution. Another example is that 12 nanometer and maybe 7 nanometer FinFET is a lot more resilient in space as well, as it turns out. So that's another byproduct. So we didn't talk a lot about that, but the type of technology node that you use in the FinFET, for example, has an impact also in terms of being resilient for bit flips. So those are fundamental aspects that drove us. Our next generation, as I mentioned, chiplets, is no longer at 12 nanometer. It's actually a lot more single-digit advanced process node. But again, we are always taking into account how do we balance the cost versus the amount of performance that we would get from it. A 5 nanometer wafer is more than 2x the price of a 12 nanometer product. So if we are able to provide the same level of performance as a 5 nanometer solution by having innovative design on software and hardware side, then that's a lot more better choice than purely building at advanced technology node.
And it was very simple. They did a challenge to say that competitors being lazy, they're trying to get 7 nanometer to get the same power out of them. If you can get in 12 nanometer, why do 7 nanometer? That was a challenge.
And just to add to that, so I would say there are certain times when you need an advanced process node. Edge, for example, I think we will continue to see that there's going to be domination of technology nodes like 12 nanometer, maybe 7 nanometer, 6 nanometer, up to 5 nanometer is a good solution in the edge because you can trade, there's a balance between performance and cost. 3 and 2 nanometer, I don't think they are in the edge side today because the cost is so high. They are a lot more relevant in the data center, and smartphones may be an example because of the volume. It's an edge product where you have 3 nanometer solutions today. But overall, the cost of producing a piece of silicon at 3 nanometer is so much higher vis-a-vis the amount of delta that you get purely from that technology node jump is not that beneficial.
So I'm afraid that we're about out of time. And there is one question on Zoom that I think is important enough to ask everybody to sit for another couple of minutes and let us deal with. But before I ask this last question, everyone, please note that next week, October 14, we have a panel talking about sovereign AI approaches in India, and it is going to be Zoom only. The auditorium is being used for another class's midterm exam, so we kind of have to not meet in person next week. So October 14 will be Zoom only. But this last question is from Rajan, and it has to do with privacy concerns about AI processing at the edge or AI computing at the edge. Are there different concerns than there are with the current system? And if so, how should consumers prepare for a world of, to preserve their privacy in a world of edge AI processing?
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned about privacy, which you should be, I think Edge is a very good solution. The whole idea is that you're running it under a localized environment, and you kind of own your data. So if you minimize the movement of critical data, so that healthcare example is a good solution and an example for you. So if that robot is able to work process a lot of that patient data locally without having to tap into essentially a cloud infrastructure all the time, that gives you a lot better handle towards your private data than what you would get from a purely data center-centric solution. Of course, it's not as easy as that. You get privacy as a byproduct of Edge solution, but then I think there is also a lot of effort towards encryption, additional pieces of technology that is being used on that piece of hardware at the edge as well, to essentially it becomes a lot more tamper-proof, where it's not so much about privacy, but security also comes into the picture. So if you think about a critical application that I talked about in a aerospace application or space application, there you have to also worry about not just the privacy of the data, but you're also worrying about whether that data is going to be secure. Can it be easily tampered by, let's say, a piece of algorithm or an open source algorithm that you run on that hardware? So those are some active pieces of development pieces that are ongoing in terms of building these pieces of silicon. But overall, I would say edge AI solutions are a lot more private or privacy preserving than purely cloud native solutions.
So this has been a fantastic program. For those of you who are here in the auditorium, I think we have some refreshments outside where you can continue the discussion. Let me encourage everyone to go outside as quickly as you can. Don't get stuck down around the stage. But I want to join everyone in saying thank you so much to Sakya and to Shri for a really clear and really informative session.